we'll go ahead and we'll turn the time over to Detective Shu. He has been an officer with the Albuquerque Police Department for a while. He was in the field. Now he, then he went to homicide, and now he is a homicide detective, and now he's part of the criminalistics team. And then that is it. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, guys. Thanks a lot for having me on this. I've been on it a few times, and you guys have always had a lot of people that I've respected on here, some really good investigators and officers, supervisors, physicians and doctors. I'm really excited that you guys asked me to be on this, and I'm also kind of humbled too. You know, I'm seeing how much people have gotten from this, and the caliber of speakers that you guys have had in the past. You know, I'm really humbled and excited to talk about my career in law enforcement. So I grew up. I'm not a native New Mexican. Clearly, I actually grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. And then I went to college in Missouri, and I wound up staying in Missouri for about 9.5 years after college. And then in August of 2006, my then girlfriend, my now wife, we moved out to Albuquerque in 2006. I graduated with a degree in business management with an emphasis in marketing. And so when I first moved out here, about the middle of August, I found a job working with a brokerage firm here in town. And I remember going to orientation for it, and then there was a week-long training in Texas in September of 2006. And the last day of training, it was a Friday. It was Friday, September 22nd of 2006. Right as the class was dismissed for the week, it was like 11:30 Central Time. I got a phone call from my mom, and she had told me, she had called to tell me that my father, she and my dad had stayed in Tennessee, in Memphis, and earlier that morning, my father was shot and killed in an incident at his business. I immediately flew home. He had a large estate that we had to get in order. It was a hard time for me to process everything because we were so busy with managing what was left of my dad's estate. Dealing with the police investigation, trying to help out detectives when I hadn't been home for almost 10 years. It was pretty challenging the first few months. I remember that the homicide detectives for the Memphis Police Department were very compassionate, very understanding. They did their best with the information that they had, but I mean, as of right now, it's my father's case has turned into a cold case. Anyways, I probably spent another 2 months in Memphis before coming back to Albuquerque. It was November before the end of October, beginning of November, when I first got back into town. I worked for the brokerage firm for a little while, and and it was like about December of 2006 that I started noticing um, all of the advertisement for APD. I don't know how many of you guys were around back in 2006, but they had all these advertisements on television. There was humongous billboards. There was ads on newspapers, the buses, and they were having a big recruitment push. And so I started really seriously considering going into law enforcement. And in February of 2007, I put my interest card in with the department. And in November of 2007, I started the academy. I specifically wanted to join the department because of my dad's homicide. The homicide unit was my ultimate goal for my career here. I had planned on being in the field for 5 to 7 years, picking up as much experience as I could. And then I intended to test for investigative spots, either in one of the area command impact units, or I had actually been seriously considering going into child exploitation. Those guys had actually asked me for a few TDYs, and I managed what I could with the time that I had in the field to go and TDY with those guys. I was, again, very flattered that they thought that highly of me to want me to go to their unit. So I took some TDYs over there, and then in February of 2015, I saw an opening for 3 homicide detectives for the unit. And I thought, well, in the past, there'd only been like maybe one opening for the unit, maybe at most 2 for the unit. I knew it was a very elite investigative group, and I honestly didn't think I had the chops to put in for the team when there was only 1 or 2 openings. But when they had the opening for 3, I was like, well, shoot, maybe I could test. Might be time for me to put my name into the investigative arena and see how I would do. And even if I didn't get the homicide spot, at least the sergeant would be introduced to me, and I could get my name in there and maybe do some TDYs while I was looking at other investigative avenues. So I tested, and to my surprise, I wound up getting the spot in one of the 3 spots. The other 2 that tested were Dave Nix and Leah Akata, both of whom have been really great speakers for your organization these past few months. I didn't actually get to start in homicide until August of 2015 because of shortages in the field. But when I did, man, it was where I wanted to be for the longest time. You know, I had a great time doing it. I think my first 2-3 years were I had a blast. Not to say that, you know, it was fun dealing with homicide and death and grief during my time there, but the unit itself at the time was very close-knit. They still are. I still keep in touch with many of them while I'm over here at the crime lab. But it was what I wanted to do. It was that was where I wanted to be in my career. So, but I started noticing some changes in how I carried myself around my family and my coworkers, and even in me as the cases wore on. I was there in 2017 when homicide was reached its first like record year. That year with 72, 74 cases, and there were only 5 or 6 of us in the unit. So the casework was, it was tough to stay afloat. There was a lot of work. We got some extra bodies in there towards the end of 2017 and into 2018, so that helped out a little bit. And then 2019 pushed through, and that was another record year. And I noticed in 2019 the kind of fatigue that I experienced when I was working cases in 2017, and I just couldn't put myself or my family through that kind of work again. There were times when I wasn't getting any sleep until 1 a.m. It was fitful sleep. I'd wake up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock, and I couldn't go back to sleep. And then I'd drift off, and I'd get maybe like 30 minutes more asleep before my alarm went off. And then, of course, call-outs were always coming in every week. We'd had 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 call-outs, and so when it came time to reassess where I wanted to be within the investigative division, I got an offer to check out criminalistics. I had been familiar with the criminalistics and the crime lab people, the major crime scene team, for pretty much my entire career. Like when I first, one of the very first trainings that I took from the department was the 2-week CSS course, and I would take that training and then go out into the field. I would still do field work and take calls for service, but I would also help out my shift and my squad by picking up their CSS, their CSI requests, and that way they could get it out into the field quicker rather than having to wait 30 minutes or an hour for a CSI unit to free up and take that call. So I was familiar with them, and with all the work that I did in homicide and the relationships that I built, talking with the CSI detectives, the major crime scene detectives, it just seemed like a pretty good natural fit for me to transition over. So I've been doing criminalistics major crime scene team since December of 2019. It's been a really good team. Everybody's been as helpful, if not more, when it comes to processing scenes and evidence, and the knowledge here is pretty incredible too. We've got some pretty well experienced people. Rick Beckstrom, he's on today. He's been doing this for a while. Andrea Ortiz, she also came from homicide over to the crime lab. She's also been a wealth of information too. I think that, so going back to some of the stuff that Nils had talked about earlier in this meeting, talking about the trauma and hardships that people go through. I really appreciated talking with some of the folks that were introduced to me during some of the mental health stuff that the department offered. When I had first learned about my dad's homicide, I don't think that I ever had the time to really properly grieve about his death. We were so busy with managing his estate and trying to help out with uh, the police investigation, and then coming back to Albuquerque and work, that I never had a chance to really grieve. And I'll say, so in the first 7 years of my career here with the department, I had disclosed my dad's homicide to maybe 5 people, because they were people that I trusted and that I knew would help me get to where I wanted to be in the department. But every time I would talk about it over the course of those 7 years, I would just break down weeping, and I didn't understand why for a really long time, and I always got awkward because these were officers in the field, and we would just be chatting about why we had joined the police department, and I would make the decision to tell them, and then I think to myself, okay, I'm going to hold it together this time, because this dude is a pretty good dude. He's really squared away. And I would talk about my dad's homicide, and it would get really awkward. It would get really awkward because, they not to say that those officers and detectives and supervisors didn't have compassion for me and my situation, but I took them by surprise with that. And I could tell that they didn't know where to go with it for a few seconds. And then I came to realize that the more that I did talk about it in a healthy environment, the more progress I made towards overcoming my grief. And it's still there. I still try to deal with it when it pops up. I remember reading On Combat by Lieutenant Grossman, and how he talks about veterans dealing with PTSD, and how he compares it to like the little dog scratching at the screen door to get in, and then it just bursts through. That's kind of how I would feel with dealing with my dad's murder. Was I'd hear that little dog scratching at the screen door, and then all of a sudden it would just burst through it. Just the oddest moments. Something would remind me, and I'd have to excuse myself for a couple minutes to gather myself. But talking about it more, and being around good people who understood where I was coming from has really helped me start to get a better handle on some of that trauma. I also thought that in my career with the department, that taking on homicide investigations and helping families and loved ones find closure for their victims would also help me start to find some closure to my dad's case. Obviously, his case is still active, or I guess it's a cold case now. So I don't know how much activity is on it right now, but I also thought that, with my background, I could relate a little bit more to those victims' families, and help them find ways to move forward in their own way, on their own terms. And I thought I was doing a pretty good job with it. I had some pretty good relationships with some of these victims' families. Even today, we'll call and talk about each other's lives. And I remember during one particular, actually there were two cases earlier in my time with homicide. One was the first one was dealing with the Lillian Garcia death. If you don't remember, that was back in like 2016. It was on I-40 westbound around Coors. It was a road rage incident. Lillian's father had cut off another driver, and that driver pulled a gun and started shooting into the vehicle and wound up striking Lillian and killing her. We had the offender in custody probably within, well, I don't know if it was in custody, but we had solved the thing probably within 48 hours. And typically in homicide, for those of you that aren't familiar with those types of investigations, after the initial call out, the following day is the autopsy. And so Lillian being, her autopsy was the following day. Lillian was I should also mention Lillian was like 8 or 9 years old, maybe younger than that, when she was killed. And at the time, I was the only homicide investigator with experience in child abuse and child death investigations. Another chunk of training that I took when I was in the field as an officer was the CARE training, the Child Abuse Response Evaluator, CARE training. So it was 4 field units who wanted to get into child abuse investigations, and you could take calls citywide to help alleviate some of the calls for service in some area commands, or for officers that weren't comfortable dealing with child abuse investigations, and a CARE officer would go out and offer some support or take over the investigation completely. Well, anyways, I was the only one in homicide who had any type of child abuse investigations under my belt, so I went to Lillian's autopsy, and she. So I had never been to a child's autopsy, a juvenile's autopsy, and I was really impressed by the pathologist and the technicians conducting the autopsy. They were very gentle. They were very, very gentle with her remains as they were performing the autopsy. I thought to myself as I was watching it that if that was my kid on the autopsy table, I don't know what I would be doing right now. Now, luckily, Lillian's was just a gunshot wound. Another case that kind of shook me was the Victoria Martins case that was following maybe a couple months after Lillian's. Again, if you're not familiar with Victoria, she was found in the Northwest at an apartment complex. She had been murdered and dismembered, and then her remains were lit on fire in the apartment's bathroom, the bathtub. Her mother, her mother's boyfriend, and then the boyfriend's cousin were ultimately arrested for it. And again, they just didn't have anybody to go to Victoria's autopsy that wanted to go. So I volunteered, and I told them that I would be able to give them an update at the end of the autopsy. Um, I think that Victoria's was different from Lillian's because of the amount of trauma that she suffered. Um, uh, the first day was all external. That's all they did was examine Victoria externally. And if you've never been into the observation room of the OMI's autopsy theater, you have to keep the lights dim so that there's no reflection off of the viewing window, because you want to be able to see the details of the autopsy. So it's a dark environment. It's recycled, recirculated air conditioning. It was definitely a lot tougher to observe Victoria's autopsy than it was for Lillian's. Luckily, I wasn't in that autopsy by myself observing her. There were two other detectives. One was Amanda Wild from Sex Crimes, and the other one was Jeff Jones, who at the time was a detective for Crimes Against Children. So I had their support going into the autopsy theater, the observation room, but it was still pretty, it still got pretty dark in there. Victoria's autopsy was a 2-day autopsy. Like I said, the first day was an external, and then the second day was all internal. And I remember going into the 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock afternoon hour of Victoria's second day of autopsy, and I was not in a good place in my head. So I told Amanda and I told Jeff that I needed to step out for a little bit and get some fresh air, and they were incredibly supportive. They just understood that I needed to go for a little bit. I probably took a couple of hours being outside in the fresh air and the sunlight before I could come back in. At the time, I understood that the behavioral health of officers and detectives and anyone really working in law enforcement or military veterans, I understood how important that was, because I worked really hard to not take this kind of stuff home with my wife. At the time, I had a 3-year-old and a newborn. And so it was, those are things I didn't want to bring home to them. But I needed to find an outlet for some of the trauma that I had seen. And I found that even if I could find someone supportive who I could talk to about this, even if it wasn't just a problem solving type of talk, if I just needed to vent and find some way to just get it off my shoulders, get it off my chest, get it out in the open, that I felt better after those talks. Around about that time, I also started to really look into mindfulness. Again, kind of tying what Nils had brought up earlier in our talk this afternoon. The thing about mindfulness for me, when I very, very first started practicing it, it was probably like my first or second year as a patrolman with the department. And I would try to find that quiet spot and think and meditate, and I found myself falling asleep after the first, 10 minutes of it, right? And I don't know how many of you guys have tried it too, but that was always what I was going through. And then I'd suddenly wake up and I'd be like, oh shit, that didn't help me at all. I just took a nap. But I started to realize that mindfulness is different for everybody. Like you had talked about, Doc, when you talked about Greg Jackson and John Bones Jones, his waterfall, finding his waterfall. I've started finding my own mindfulness in other places other than just sitting in a chair in a quiet room. Actually, quite the opposite. I started to find my mindfulness when I was working out. I would, so I'll also tell this story. So when I first came into homicide, it was a 3-month OJT period. So you're on call for 3 months straight, and you're going out to all the call outs, trying to learn the ropes, writing warrants, writing reports, taking on small cases yourself. So it's a really challenging first 3 months of OJT. And after those first 3 months, I took a look at myself and I saw that I had gained 20 to 25 pounds. And I was like, holy shit. And it was because I was sitting at a desk all day long, reviewing old reports or typing up a warrant or looking through video, or I'd be sitting at a desk and talking to a victim or a witness. I'd be sitting at a desk and just analyzing surveillance footage. It was a lot of sedentary stuff for 40 plus hours a week, and it's no surprise you gain a lot of weight when you're not active. So I started working out more when I was after those first 3 months of OJT, and I started to practice my mindfulness after the Lillian Garcia and Victoria Martin's cases as I was working out. And I would focus again on what you had talked about, Doc, was concentrating on breathing. I'd concentrate on technique. If I found my mind drifting, I'd bring it back to what I was doing in the present time. And I found first off that I would leave my workouts feeling better about my day, feeling better about me. I found myself more centered. And it was a good way to release a lot of the tension and stress that would build up over the course of a day or a week or a month of intense investigations. So you had mentioned, Doctor, that quote from Bruce Lee. There's another quote from Bruce Lee that I also like, which is, adapt what is useful, discard what is useless, and insert yourself into everything. And like I said, just sitting in a quiet room in the dark and being mindful and focusing on breathing, that wasn't working for me. But I knew that that practicing mindfulness would help me mentally and emotionally. And so instead of falling asleep in a quiet part of the house, I found solace in my workouts. And so so those really did help out for quite a while. But like I said, after the 2019 record year, I started noticing that fatigue in me again and not wanting to put my family through that type of stress again. So I made the transition into the major crime scene team. It's still intense, but it's not as intense. And so I've been really enjoying my career with the department and all the options that have been given to me. It's been good so far, it's been real good. So that's pretty much my story up to this point. of my career.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. You always inspire me, always. I remember being a rookie, going to the Valley, and that's where you were, trying to live up to you and a lot of the people that you were working with at that time. Does anyone from the network have any questions or comments for Andrew? You can unmute yourself or you can type them into the chat. Rick Ingram told you good job.
I think he said awesome job.
Oh, I apologize. Awesome job.
Sure. I mean, while people formulate questions, I have a couple. Grief is an ongoing process that just comes in waves. I mean, do you feel like you were talking about how you didn't process that? Do you feel like you have, and how did you do it?
I think I'm in a better place with my grief. I mean, talking to everyone just now, I could still feel a little bit of that hitch in my throat as I was talking about it. But like I said, the more that I talk about it in a healthy environment, the more progress I feel that I'm making towards getting better. And I mean, I know it's not going to get better. I sure would like to find some closure for that case, for my dad's case, and you know, I wouldn't mind taking a peek at some of the reports and the case file myself, but you know, I don't think I'm ready for that yet.
Had your dad, is that the reason, the fundamental reason you went into homicide? Had he not been murdered, would you not be a police officer?
Probably not. I probably would have stuck in business and marketing and been with that brokerage firm even today. So.
And then I have one last question. Oh, unless other people have it. No, I'll let the other folks ask their questions. There's a question in the chat, Jeff.
So Maureen O'Brien said, first off, thank you for sharing your very personal story. And then she asked, did you ever go to grief counseling?
I wouldn't call it, I guess, formally grief counseling, but I have talked with therapists and specialists about my dad's homicide, and the grief and the process of working through it. So, I mean, I wouldn't call it formally grief counseling, but I have talked with people about it.
Nice. And then Rasha Sturba said, Andrew, you are an incredible human. I'm grateful to have worked with you, honored to know your story, and I hope you are enjoying my old office. Miss you.
I am. I've taken all your old stuff out, Rashay, and thrown it in a dumpster and put all my stuff into it.
I have unless anybody else has a question, you can just cut me off. But about mindfulness, I think you're exactly right about finding your own way. Like I had talked about the breath, but you can find your own path. But it's also good to have guides and teachers. Did you have books? Did you have other people? Did you have a teacher?
So I started looking into mindfulness, actually kind of as a way to help me process my grief. I remember reading one book on it, and it tied how children and or adult children deal with a parent's death. And part of it was understanding that, you know, juvenile children deal with the loss of a parent differently, especially if it's you know, a violent death or a natural causes death. And then it talked about how an adult would process that same type of incident from someone who's like 20 to 35, and then how someone would deal with it from, you know, 40 plus, you know. And you know, when you're 40 or older and you have parents who pass away, it's different because, you know, most of the time it's from natural causes or something along those lines. When you were my age, you know, in your mid 20s, mid to late 20s, it was different. And I kind of equate it to feeling like most people that I talk to about this have been, of course, you know, native New Mexicans or native Albuquerqueans. I talk about how, as someone who's lived in Albuquerque for a while, perhaps you start your morning off with a cup of coffee and you stand at your kitchen window as you start your routine, and you just look over to the East Mountains and meditate on the start of the day with your cup of coffee. And then one day you wake up and you start your normal routine and you make your cup of coffee and you stand in front of your kitchen window, and all of a sudden you see that the mountains aren't there anymore. That was the kind of loss that I felt as I started to come to terms with my dad's death. It was just a sudden loss of something that I thought was going to be there for a lot longer than what had actually happened. And there's a lot of regret and sorrow, and that was really the only way I could really compare it to someone who, while living here in Albuquerque, you know. And I started to really practice mindfulness probably right after the Victoria Martins case came to light. I started reading a couple other books on it. There was an event, like a 6-week event hosted by the city, open to all the departments for practicing mindfulness. I downloaded that insight timer that you had talked about. And I've been trying to practice all of that stuff while, as I start to recognize, you know, those signs of stress and trauma as they start to bubble up more and more, you know.
Thank you.
So in the chat, Aortes said, "Thank you for sharing, Andrew. We all joke about how long Andrew takes while conducting interviews and processing scenes, but we all have learned a great deal of patience from you and the way you look at scenes and pick apart interviews. And sharing your story gives us better understanding why you do what you do." And then Mark has a question for you.
Hey, Andrew. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very, very heartstrong. I'm sure it must have been very difficult to work a homicide and being triggered by your dad's homicide. I'm sure every time when you worked one, that's the first thing that came to your mind. So thank you for sharing your story. I really, truly appreciate it. Is your dad's case being worked at all, or is it strictly a cold case?
I think it's strictly a cold case. The last time I got an update from the detectives was maybe 10 or 11 years ago. Wow. And it wasn't good news. It was more along the lines of, just a heads up, I'm moving out of the homicide division and I'm transferring your case to another detective. And that was it.
Sorry to hear that. There's an organization, Andrew, out of Jacksonville, Florida. It's a nonprofit. It's called Project Cold Case. And it's ran by a friend of mine, Ryan Bachman, whose dad was was also a homicide victim. That's still a cold case. So if you're ever interested in reaching out to them, I know Ryan on a personal level, and I'd be more than happy to do whatever I can for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
What they do is they'll take a cold case, and if I'm correct, they have retired detectives either as advisors or working for them, and they take the case and try and work it from their angle. And they just solved I want to say a 20-year plus homicide literally not too long ago.
No kidding. That's awesome. Would you mind, what was the name of that organization again?
It's called projectcoldcase.org, projectcoldcase.org. His name is Ryan, my Boston accent's kicking in here, Bachman, like the potato chips, Bachman, Bachman Turner Overdrive. You're probably too young for that, but so.
I get it.
Okay, all right, good. A little BTO is not a bad thing.
No.
So, and Ron's a friend of mine. You can mention my name. I'm Mark Tabana from Blue Help, and Ryan's a great guy. And I know if you ask him to work it, he'll work it. And I like to see the bad guy get caught, absolutely, or bad person, whoever it was, you know.
If you want, I can send you guys an email introduction if you want to.
Yeah, that'd be great, Nils. Thank you, man. Appreciate it. And Andrew, thanks again, brother, and stay strong.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Melissa has a question now.
Andrew, I wanted to say thank you for coming on to our network and sharing your story. We've been pursuing you right from when we first started, so I'm glad we finally figured out a time that you could do it, and I really am honored that I'm honored that I'm able to be here. I had a question. You said that you found some relief in just like venting or just talking about, you know, the cases, I guess, or just what you were going through. And I guess my question is, who do you think like helped you the most talking to? Just anyone or other officers or your spouse? And what do you think brought the relief from that?
I don't know. I think everyone that I had disclosed to at some point has had something to offer to me from their experiences and backgrounds. You know, when I would speak to, you know, therapists about it, it was definitely good to know that there wasn't any type of judgment. There wasn't any type of, you know, I'm going to solve this problem for you, Andrew. This is what you need to do. It was just good to talk and get that out into the open and to someone who would just listen and be a good listener and not offer judgment or advice or you know, the things that I wasn't looking for when I wanted to talk to them. Now, on the other side of things, you know, part of that is also on me because, you know, when I would talk to people who weren't therapists, I would, you know, it's just natural for cops to want to solve problems, right? So they would offer their advice. And, you know, I should have probably prefaced it with, you know, I'm not looking for advice or, you know, a way to solve this problem. It's just, it's nice to be able to talk to a friend about it and then start into a disclosure about what brought me to the department. So, you know, it's, you know, I've been approached that way too. And it's actually kind of nice just to be able to just sit and listen to a friend or a coworker just dump the crap that they've been going through and then not have the stress of trying to solve their problem. You know, it's nice to just be able to just sit there and listen and, you know, sympathize and empathize and tell them, shit, that really sucks. I know you're strong enough to get through it and I'm here for you if you need me.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments for Andrew before we close for the day?
I just want to thank you again for being here. It's really great.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. Again, you guys have had some really good speakers on, and I hope I managed to live up to some little bit of what they've been able to do.
You did great.
I appreciate it. You did great, Andrew. You always are inspiring to me, but very much so today. There will be an email sent out with a survey link. If you guys could fill that out, it helps us get better. We really like the comments that come in. Next month, we will be having Scott Mendoza. He is from FirstNet AT&T. He lives in Texas. He was an Air Force drone pilot, and he's going to discuss his vicarious trauma that he witnessed while he was a drone pilot, and discuss him living with PTSD. Great presentation. I've seen it before when I went out to Miami earlier in the year before COVID started. But he'll be here for next month. If anyone else has any other questions, you guys can always reach us on either go SCION. Oh, go ahead.
That's also an open session, so people can invite others, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So anybody who thinks interested in that, please let them know.
And if anyone feels like they would like to share their story, you guys can always reach out, and we would love to have you present for us. And with that, we will see you guys all next month.